Hi everyone, I'm Jeremy Depow, and I'm really pleased to be speaking to you today. It's always a pleasure to be with Serene-risc. I've been following the organization for many years, and really appreciate the great work that they do. And so it's a real privilege to share the work that we're doing at the Internet Society Canada chapter on mitigating consumer information and technology, IoT consumer threats. And the reason I've brought you out here today is it's kind of interesting. I'm in rural New Brunswick, and we have actually have not had any rain all summer long, and that's pretty important around here. Especially because we're really close to a place called McCain's, and McCain's is the company that makes the pizza pockets and French fries that you've been feeding your kids during the lockdowns. So why that's important is, all this rain is really wonderful to have today. It's a little late in the season for the potatoes, but it is good for people's wells, because around here everybody uses wells for their water supply, and the wells all of a sudden got really low, and people were struggling to get their water. So what would be helpful in a certain situation like that? That would be sensors in a person's well, so that they can figure out what the level is going to be and what kind of mitigation efforts they have to take place in terms of doing laundry, etc. The other thing that's relevant, why the farming sector is so important, one of the things I wanted to show you, but they've already done the harvesting, is the corn crop. Corn crop is all planted by GPS, and I know that because someone took me into the corn crop on their mother's golf cart, and I started going through their crop, and I could see just how perfectly planted they are. So when you think about that, you're thinking about advancing that technology where it's actually communicating with the number of devices. And of course, in a farming environment, just like we're seeing more and more with people working from home from COVID-19, an incredible unprecedented jump in what we were expecting a few years ago, farmers also work from home, and in their homes are often more and more IoT devices, all kinds of devices, whether it's a smart refrigerator, which adoption still is relatively low, but you do have the Alexas and the other brands that are very connected. So what I'm trying to say about that is the interconnection between work and the home. And today we have a lot of people like myself and other important people that I know that work from home for a few days of the week, and then they have to go to the office, and you never know what they're taking from the home environment to the office, given the number of threats that we've seen in the work we've done with our IoT project, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So a little bit about the Internet Society Canada chapter's project on consumer IoT threats. We started the project a couple of years ago and finally had our first forum on February 2nd. At that time, there were only 9 COVID-19 cases in Canada. And what we've been doing, and this is a really important point, and probably one of the key insights I want to give you today, and that is it's a multi-stakeholder approach to looking at some of the challenges that we have in dealing with IoT threats for consumers. And that means bringing in a lot of different perspectives. It means academia, government, business, other relevant thought leaders, and civil society. So we bring a lot of different expertise from around the world, including our closest allies, and have these discussions. We started out with an in-person forum, and now we're doing things like this that are virtual. Now I brought you here because I was talking about the agriculture sector. And it's raining, like I mentioned, but a couple weeks ago it was dusty, very, very dusty. There was no water in the ground. And as a result, the crops, the potatoes that are coming out of the fields, is not very fruitful. And one of the things that is interesting is that they declared a state of emergency not far from here in Maine because of drought. And what you see behind me here is Smuggler's Road. And it's called Smuggler's Road because just down the road is Maine, where they declared that state of emergency. And of course, droughts don't really stop at borders. The relevance of that is what technology and IoT devices can do to detect things like soil saturation and help farmers determine what their crop is going to look like, what kind of money they're going to get per acreage, and how much that crop is going to weigh, because the weight is really how they make their money. And when you don't have any rain, you don't have any weight. So that kind of thing is really important, and things that we're seeing further adopted in various agriculture environments around the world. All right, so now not far from the farmers' fields, we're in front of a hydroelectric dam in Grand Falls, New Brunswick, which produces 66 megawatts with 4 turbines. Back in 2017, they started looking at putting a 100 megawatt one in, but I don't really see that started yet. Key thing here is we're all within the same area, all agriculture, a lot of trucking, and they said we're close to the U.S. And I have to thank one of our funding sponsors, the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, as well as Amazon and Ryerson. But all that connectivity shows how vulnerable things can be. And the point being, you have people working in these facilities, and you also have people going about their day-to-day lives. And something like this, and a bigger, newer dam in the near future, certainly we're going to see a great deal of IoT devices. Okay, so it's a much sunnier day today, and I wanted to reinforce the point about multi-stakeholder input, and that's because it was brought up by Nazli Shukri, a professor from MIT, who talked about in our first forum the lack of engagement by civil society. And so that's why this project of engaging civil society in this discussion is so important. Now, we're in a different area, and I'm not going to sort of say exactly where, but we're in a family residential area, and it's a family dwelling. And why that's important is because we have 2 children and 1 single adult, all using the same network, all with personal devices, and 1 adult working from home. The children now, of course, doing a lot of work from school. So what you have is a common password, a well-known password, and that's exchanged with family members and some close friends. And then you have devices that some are older and don't have the updates, the software updates that we've talked about as important in mitigating cyber threats. And a lot of connectivity happening on the same connectivity device. So that is, I think, an example of really what we see very much in common with everybody else in communities, and that have the sort of average awareness of what cybersecurity is. And I'll give one more antidote, and that was a few weeks ago when I was in a school environment, and it was with teachers. About 70 teachers and school workers, and my colleague asked the question, how many people in this room have heard about cybersecurity? And out of that 70 people, 4 rose their hand. So that's just framing up what I'm going to talk to you about in terms of the actual insights that we've derived from our forums. So the reality is that, to put it frankly, consumers are really not where, in terms of awareness, not necessarily the priority emphasis. There are some things that have been identified through our forums and discussions that do stick out, and those are things like references to Smokey the Bear campaign that those of us with a few years behind us would remember, and also putting things in the curriculum in schools for students to start to learn about cyber hygiene at an early age and become more aware of its importance. The other thing, of course, is the interesting programs that we're seeing, like Cyber Patriot in the United States, that has now come to Canada under various sub-brands like Cyber Titan, and those programs are really quite successful. And then one last component that we've had a lot of discussion about is, of course, labeling. And we know that when we are going to the store to buy a product, we're really looking at how much is it, what are the features of it, does it have. Sometimes the comparison would be to purchasing a dishwasher or a dryer, and you often look for that energy compliance seal. So things like that, where consumers would recognize a label that it has gone through a certain process and the manufacturer adheres to something, is perhaps an area that should continue to be explored. I know a lot of people are doing that. Therefore, the emphasis that we've found in terms of the insights that we've gathered has really been on what can governments, manufacturers specifically, and civil society, folks in the supply chain and the entire ecosystem, what can they do to really help mitigate, protect consumers from IoT threats as these devices proliferate more and more.
So I had a little technical difficulty, so we're back in the home studio. And just to carry on, these sharing operations centers are proving to be really valuable assets and allowing organizations to collect and share insights, share the experiences that they're having from day to day, such as those operating in the financial systems, electrical systems, critical infrastructure. They can share information and learn from each other in a manner that isn't otherwise allowed. So we have CCTX, as I mentioned. We also have Cyber New Brunswick's Transparency Center that it's developing, and its existing critical information or critical infrastructure sharing operations center. Another layer to that that was discussed in our sessions is the ability for researchers to look into the devices and really drill down and take them apart and provide some public research on what they find. And right now there are some problems and hurdles, legal hurdles, that organizations like the Citizen Lab, which has become world-renowned in its work, can face when it does its important work as a civil society actor. The other item is standards, and standards have become increasingly important, and there are a variety of organizations that are producing standards, from Cybersecure Canada, the Standards Council of Canada, other entities like NIST in the United States, ISO, and a variety of groups, and also a lot of private sector organizations. So that's both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is that there's some good work being done that organizations can, small businesses and businesses can look at and achieve certain standards when it's required by work they're doing with the government or for their insurance or other vendors. The challenge is that there are so many that harmonization becomes a question and one that there becomes a need for. So those are all very important, and we're going to have an upcoming workshop on the 27th of this month to talk about the small business standards environment. And the other thing is understanding how complicated devices are. And devices we see in the market are some very well put together and already working to achieve the greatest of standards out there. Others are coming from all over the world and very cheaply made. So it's important that companies, organizations, and entrepreneurs, when they're developing devices, to really use a security or privacy, safety by design attitude. Because what we have heard from some of the lawyers that look at these things in our forums is that they will receive a device and they're asked to meet certain standards, and the manufacturer just can't meet those standards because they haven't taken that into account from the beginning. Lastly, perhaps before lastly, is with respect to standards, the question of voluntary versus being required to do so. And that's an important discussion that must be had, because there's one thing to be said that you need to do this, but providing the incentives and ensuring that it's done is another question, keeping in mind the fact that small businesses cannot be overwhelmed and burdened by regulation that prevents them from doing what they're really trying to do, which is solve important problems for consumers. Lastly, the geopolitical environment has certainly been prevalent in our discussions, especially speaking to folks, our allies, on what's happening in terms of the global cybersecurity warfare environment, or this new dimension of warfare that it's often referred to. And we know that major powers are no longer sitting back and twiddling their thumbs and observing what's happening. They're actually structured now to engage day to day in offensive cyber operations. So that poses a significant challenge when we have a Wild West, and how there can be a transference of cyber to physicality. And we've seen that, of course, with WannaCry and Stuxnet and other very famous attacks that have occurred. So that's when we start talking about non-proliferation treaties, such as we have seen in the nuclear environment. And that's becoming a really interesting discussion, and those are happening in multilateral and bilateral environments with some really important international institutions, and that work continues. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today. And I want to thank Franca Palazzo, my co-chair and executive director of the Internet Society of Canada, as well as our funding sponsors, our partners that we could not be continuing this work, especially under the environment and transitioning. Without them, this couldn't continue. So we're excited, and I'm pleased to answer any questions that you have about the work that we're doing and diving deeper into some of these high-level matters that I've brought up. So thank you.